But let's go back to Bill. As I said, Bill missed out on both the stimulus payments, $1,400 and $900. And now what's even more disheartening for Bill is that in the recent federal budget, he's missed out yet again. Most of Australia's pensioners got a rise, an historic rise in the budget, which came down in May. That was $32.50 additional a week. It went to aged pensioners, disability support pensioners, carers and veteran affairs pensioners, which is great, it's terrific. And they certainly needed it. And they'll be in a position to better manage financially now than they were when the economic downturn started. But what about Bill? Bill's unemployed, unemployment's growing. What did he get in the budget? If he needs or can do some training, he'll get an additional payment while that training takes place. But essentially that's all. The federal government's employment focus is on the cash injections into the economy for nation building and job creation. The things I talked about before, for clean energy, for roads, for school, for housing and for insulation, solar hot water, which again is really terrific targeting of dollars. The employment focus is also on training. Tens of thousands of new productivity training places have been created. Again, most positive initiative. Maybe Bill will get one of those places. Maybe he'll find a training place, and I certainly hope he does. But right now, he's left on a single New Start payment of $227 a week, plus some rent assistance. The government argues that the New Start allowance, which is why they didn't increase it, is only a temporary payment, which says that unemployment is only temporary, it's short term. Sadly, however, for thousands, hundreds of thousands of Australians, being out of work is not short term. As I said earlier, the number of Australians unemployed, it's now at 650,000, and with just about half of those recently unemployed. And it really is very instructive to talk to employment service providers about those newly unemployed Australians. Many have never been out of work before, and when they arrive at an employment service, which is what they have to do, they're pretty angry about losing their job, and they're even angrier about having to be on what they're terming as welfare, a Centrelink payment. And what's worse is, so they've got anger about losing their job, they've got anger about being on a payment, and they haven't had to apply for a job for such a long time that they haven't a clue about how you apply for a job now. So they've got to go through that whole process of learning about applying for a job online and everything that that takes. So that's the kind of idea of the newly unemployed. They're struggling with a reality they don't want and they don't like. And they're certainly hoping that in line with the government's view of unemployment, that it will be only short term. But of those 650,000 unemployed, about half are long-term unemployed. They've been out of work for over a year, with about 150,000 of those out of work for 2 years or more. So to call a New Start allowance short-term flies in the face of the facts. The long-term unemployed are often the ones who get the dole bludger tags, but if you sit down and talk with some of them, they either want a job and simply just can't get lucky, or there are some serious issues preventing most of them doing so. Mental illness is a very big one. About 30% of the long-term unemployed have some form of a mental health issue. Where they live is another, often in outer suburban areas or in regional or remote Australia. And many of them lack appropriate skills. And yes, there is a section of the long-term unemployed who simply don't want to work, and they are a constant challenge to the employment services. But there were no specific programs or targeting of the long-term unemployed in the last federal budget, and there should have been. Because as I said before, the experience of the last major recession in the early 90s showed definitively that many of those who became unemployed during that time never worked again. Someone like Bill wants a job. He's a man in his middle years. He doesn't want a pension. ACOS is advocating for unemployed Australians like Bill, that there be a paid work experience program introduced. A paid work experience program with a government-supported wage that is about twice the New Start allowance. Such a program would assist Bill into a workplace for up to 6 months. That workplace would mostly be some level of government or maybe the not-for-profit sector. It would put him back into a work environment, allow him to develop appropriate on-the-job skills, and importantly give him current work experience and a reference from his employer. I outlined our paid work experience proposal to a group of long-term unemployed, mostly women, at an outer Sydney employment service, and they loved it. One woman told me her story. She'd raised 2 kids, her marriage broke up, she needed work. She'd done some basic office training through the employment service, but she didn't have that critical piece of paper that outlined her recent work experience, so she just couldn't get an interview. No recent work history. Yet as she argued, she had the experience of raising a family, managing that family. She said she'd be reliable, she wouldn't go out on drunken nights binging, and she said she'd treat those she worked with very well, but she just couldn't get a job. So she liked the idea of 6 months into a workplace. Another woman gave me a more disheartening story. She had qualifications that included, interestingly enough, childcare and forklift driving. But prospective employers lost interest in her because she had 2 young teenagers, and they told her that she'd be always taking off time to look after them, either sickness or school obligations, something like that. So there are real challenges ahead of us, and the biggest one, I mean, there's many challenges in a recession, but tackling the challenge of long-term unemployed is probably the biggest issue of this recession. And ACOS and other organisations will continue to work with the federal government on making sure that what we experienced in the recession, particularly of the 90s, doesn't become what happens in this recession of 2009. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Robert Fagan. Bob Fagan is from Macquarie University, a graduate of the Australian National University, where he studied economics and geography, which essentially means that economics isn't just a thing that's out there. Economics actually has to have a place for it to happen. People would have seen Bob in the 80s and 90s explaining the restructuring of a lot of Australia's manufacturing industry to ABC viewers on the 7:30 report and Four Corners and other programs as Australia restructured its manufacturing industry and as famous brands like Vegemite and Arnott's went overseas. And I remember distinctly that Bob revealed to Kerry O'Brien that his favourite biscuit was in fact the Sao. If you Googled Bob, you would get his career in the universities and as an economic geographer, but you would also find that he is the father of Australia's first family of folk. So Bob and his wife Margaret and children James and Catherine are indeed Australia's first folk family with a number of successful folk albums, which not surprisingly sing a lot about restructuring of the coal industry and the weaving industry and other industries around the world. So he can't get away from this topic, and more recently Bob is still working on food, and now he's turned his research and teaching arm to urban food security, which I think he's going to talk to us a little bit about tonight, which includes some work, important work that he's doing at Macquarie University with the Centre for Research on Social Inclusion with the Australian Red Cross. So please welcome Bob Fagan to the microphone.
The 2 talks we've heard so far have actually set me up perfectly because Raja has talked to you about the recession, and he's talked about the kinds of things that we can know, at least in terms of the experience we had from previous ones. And we forget our history at our great peril, even though we can't parachute anything from previous recessions onto this one, because particularly in a globalised economy, and you hear people talking to you about that all the time, the world's kind of churning, it's turning upside down really quickly in economic senses. So even the recession of 1991 tells us important things, but it won't tell you a lot of the really important stuff about what's going to happen this time. So it's a difficult issue. Clare reminded us of actually what it feels like to be fairly suddenly in that position of joblessness. And so my role really is to talk about the geography of that, which is pretty appropriate given that I've had a pretty good career out of being a geographer and trying to persuade people that geography matters